can you hear me? Live streaming is on.
We can hear you. We can hear you fine, Alvaro. That was weird. I remember the last couple of times you came online and you had this weird voice, but you're technically fine right now. So we hear you loud and clear.
Yeah, it's random. So I am a bit overly concerned every time I join the meeting. Hello, Gonzalo. Nice to see you again.
I don't know what it is, but it just might be location. But it's good to have you here. It's good to see you guys came online and that we had a few participants this week. Yeah, sorry, the last few weeks have been mind-bogglingly busy for me, and I had the time the last week to set up some more events, and now this week to set up this one. And I think what I'll do is directly after we end our discussion today, I'll just go online and I will just set the next date for our next virtual discussion. And towards the end of our meetup today, we'll actually make a point to take 10 minutes to discuss what what our theme or topic is for the next time. That way it's set and I don't have to think about it, and we just put it on the agenda. So, but in thinking about what to discuss today, I know I wrote a description on the meetup event, but I thought it would be prudent to kind of open up and introduce what exactly the point of the topic today is. And I had a couple of thoughts. For one thing, usually in the past, it has been easy to plan the next virtual discussions, because at the end of every virtual discussion, I hear feedback from everybody, and there was actually a good rhythm going on, maybe between last December or January until like May or June. And it was perfect. It was every week we had a discussion, and then there would be 7 to 10 people online, and 1 or 2 of them would give a suggestion of what to do next week. And we just kept that rhythm going. And it was serendipitous in the sense that every month there would happen to be a collection of events that all surrounded a main theme. But we haven't had that in a little while. And I thought that maybe giving us a rough structure, allowing people to make suggestions, we would still be open to suggestions, but at least getting a basic structure in would help structure us a little bit better, rather than me fiddling around ideas in my head of what to talk about. So it doesn't rely on me, but it doesn't rely on other people necessarily if they don't want to give input or they don't have an idea for what to do next. And the idea came to me that, especially for this next book of the month in December, that's quite a more intensively written book from an academic who wrote about virtue ethics in general and specifically Stoicism. And there are some problems in philosophy, especially in regards to naturalistic philosophies like Stoicism, that he wanted to address in the book. And the problems he only spoke about a little bit in the introduction, so I'm not really giving away anything in the book, but I am introducing topics that he discusses in the book. So I thought it would help in 2 ways. It would help introduce what the book of the month next month would be about. And it would also give people a chance to kind of explore those ideas. So when they go into the book, especially something this heavy, it wouldn't be foreign to them and it would be an easier read. So I gave 2 topics for this book, but we're going to start with the first one and see where it goes. And that first one, I believe we've discussed before, but it's been a while. And sometimes it's good to recycle some discussions, especially a discussion this important. And the basic question that surrounds the topic is, what drives you to be a Stoic? What drives you to basically not just be a Stoic, but in virtue ethics in general? What drives you to be a virtuous or good person? Is it the virtue itself? Do you say to yourself, I want to be virtuous, I want to be a good person? Or is that only a means to an end? Do you say to yourself, I only want to be virtuous because in the end they'll have a good, happy life? Or is it the other way around? Is happiness or eudaimonia, a flourishing life, is that really only a byproduct of being virtuous? And I hear conflicting answers from some Stoics, even nowadays. And even back then, I can, throughout the meeting bring some quotes I found that kind of illustrate the discrepancy. Some Stoics think differently on this subject. Gonzalo, you wanted to speak and introduce your thoughts about this.
From my perspective, at least, I kind of like do it because it's aligned to me. I'm not, let's say, I do it. I think that it's more aligned to by the virtue itself, because that's why I think that it's aligned with the way that I see the world. But I don't think that the rule applies or needs to really apply to everyone. I think that, especially with something like kind of like I don't know, eudaimonic sounds more in the sense of a global life related thing that I think that each one of us has to decide in how. And for me, life doesn't have any, let's say, any purpose at all other than just existing. I disagree with the phrase of the purpose of life is being happy. I kind of like think that the purpose of life is just existing and that's it. And kind of like in that knowing myself, I kind of like search for things that I will do as another human being interacting with me, or vice versa. So kind of like I try to frame it only on the virtue part. But again, that's kind of like my take and view of the world. So I don't think that there's something that can kind of like apply to everyone.
Yeah, thanks. And you make a good point that it's nowadays it's hard to come by somebody who thinks there's a definite purpose to life for everybody. I mean, unless you ascribe to a more general ideology and you think that's universalizable, but that can apply to everybody. But for most people who don't strictly abide by some ideology or doctrine and think that that's applicable to everybody, that there's not really a goal in life, there's no meaning in life, in the sense that there's no meaning given to you, there's no meaning that the universe gives to you. The meaning of your life is the meaning that you give it. And then it sounds like what you're saying is that you don't necessarily have a target, that your meaning maybe in the act of living, but there's no goal of life. There's no end to which you're looking at. Maybe you get some good things out of it, to living well and into living virtuously, but it's not like you're looking to the future and saying, I want peace of mind and I want good fortune and I want happiness. I'm paraphrasing a quote here, but in the sense that you're only looking at each day and saying, how can I live like a good person and live well? And that's the kind of the apex of what the meaning of life is for you. Alvaro.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it is very challenging maybe to come up with a meaning of life that applies to everyone. Also, I think it is very challenging to find common ground on what is happiness. But I think it is easier maybe to come to an agreement when we define what is suffering, or what causes suffering, or what causes unhappiness. And I think most people would at least tend to think in general terms, not so much as an individual, but most people would maybe think about a world where there are no wars, there is no poverty, there is no oppression. And then from that macro perspective, you can go more to the individual and maybe think, okay, I want a life where I'm not in constant conflict with other people. So coming from that perspective, I think it is easier to embrace the idea of being happy from a Stoic point of view, of being virtuous, because you will tend to think, okay, if everybody's acting virtuously, if everybody is acting in a good manner, there will be less space for things as oppression, wars, conflict among people, etc. With that said, I think many people, and I'm probably gonna throw in a little bit of economics here. And I think, Steve, in one of the previous meetings, you were saying that many people see happiness. I think it was happiness from a very utilitarian perspective, and I think that this fits really well. So many people may come to the conclusion of, okay, we don't want these things. So in order to do that, the idea is for me, at least, since I'm only accountable for me, to live virtuously and hope that other people will live virtuously. There is a book in Stoicism called The Republic. I forgot who the author is, and it has the same title as the Republic, which is very famous. But this one in particular, The Republic, it's basically the idea in that Republic in which everybody either is a wise person or is striving to become a wise person. And thus, in that Republic, people tend to live virtuously, and because of that, happily. I think that's is sort of an ideal, and it's very hard to implement in real life. And I think that's when you start seeing, at least from an individual perspective, people who choose either, okay, I want to contribute towards everybody, towards a better world in which all of us are happy and we don't have any wars, we don't have any conflicts. And if there are, at least I'm chipping in my part. So if the other person is not doing that, at least I'm doing it. And there are some other people who are just maybe very bluntly realistic, and they are like, okay, not everyone is going to pursue virtuousness, and because of that, maybe happiness is not attainable in that way. So instead of defining happiness in terms of them trying to be virtuous, they just try to play the system and get the best out of the system. And that's when I wanted to throw like a little bit of economics. I'm sure you may be familiar with the prisoner's dilemma, in which it is in a scenario in which you're trying to, maybe I don't know how to explain it, but the idea is that if everybody collaborates, we will be better off. But if not everyone is collaborating, sometimes if you compromise and you don't collaborate, maybe you're getting the best outcome for you alone. Yet you're risking also that you're not getting the best outcome for yourself and for other people. So I think that's when many people, they're just realistic and they're like, okay, not everybody's gonna live virtuously. So let me think in a more Machiavellian type of way. I'm gonna act virtuously when it is convenient, and I'm not gonna act virtuously when I don't think that's gonna still avoid oppression. So even if there's gonna be oppression, I want to be the one who is on the top, not the one who's being oppressed. Yeah.
You make a good point, though, that ties in with Gonzalo's what Gonzalo said before, that that the again part of the project of Stoicism and of virtue ethics, but especially Stoicism, because this is definitely not in line with Epicureanism. So the Stoicism is that part of the project of living well is to live by contributing to society and to community, being good to others. Otherwise, they would not have made cosmopolitanism or justice such an important part of their philosophy. And to do that, they can't let personal happiness or personal ambition get in the way. So they perhaps sometimes need to prioritize things like justice and virtues like justice above their own immediate living well. Even if overall their life is lived well, which is a good point to make, that also through the lens of what's part of the project of Stoicism, what do the virtues say? And if one of them says to make life equitable and livable for everybody, then quite obviously, then perhaps eudaimonia can't necessarily be an end in the short term for everybody. But definitely in the long term, in the sense of feeling like you've lived good and you lived nobly and you lived well, you make a good point that virtue takes precedence over the kind of the next steps or the next actions you're taking in the short term. I also, just before I flip to Gonzalo, I just wanted to also echo Yannis's quote from the Meditations, which highlights the fact that despite eudaimonia having a very high place in Stoic ethics, they still maintain the fact that the only good is virtue, that the only thing that is anti-evil, the only thing that is a good thing to have is virtue, which is a little bit weird if somebody first studies Stoicism because they see eudaimonia pop up in the good life and the flourishing life and tranquility pop up all the time. But Yannis's quote from the Meditations also highlights the fact that some Stoics, like Marcus Aurelius, definitely feel that virtue takes precedence over eudaimonia. That the goal, that the end of Stoic ethics shouldn't be eudaimonia. It should be virtue, and then eudaimonia only comes as a result.
Exactly.
If you come to that point. Correct me if I'm wrong, Yannis.
Yeah, this is exactly the case. Yeah. And again, I don't know if should we use the word happiness, or should we use better the word good life, or should we use the word eudaimonia? Like you said, I think Stoics don't talk about happiness, but in any case, to live a good life, yeah, I think this is because you said this question in the beginning, what comes first, and I think it's the you described it very well. To live a good life means to live a life according to the virtue, and then the Stoics give a specific answer what kind of virtues these are, and then the result of this is that you can be sure that you have lived a good life, you have reached the eudaimonia, maybe, yes. So it's a kind of answer of the Stoics to the question, what is the goal of our lives? What is the meaning of life, right?
And thank you. And Gonzalo, you raised your hand a while ago, but I didn't know if you wanted to respond just to Alvaro or now also to Yannis as well.
Sorry. Kind of like it's weird because I think that kind of like I feel that sometimes we have a chicken and egg problem. Kind of like, not that that problem hasn't been resolved, because we all know that it has been resolved. The egg was first, sorry, and ta-da! But what I meant is that let's if we are going to say that one of the things that makes easy living for you in this planet, in this existence right now, are the skills and how you use the tools that the environment provides for you, then of course that it makes sense to chase something like virtue, because virtue is that, the practice of your skills. But on the other hand, I think that if everybody's chasing that, it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's chasing the same thing, because everybody has completely different skills. So if and not only skills, but interest and points of view, that kind of like we cannot generalize. Like each one of the human beings is a simple and complete universe. Sorry. And if everybody is chasing that virtue, I don't think that it will make the world peaceful. I think that that's a romanticism way of seeing how people work, because because that doesn't even happen in nature. In nature, everybody's it's kind of like following their true instincts and only eating when they are hungry, for example. But babies are still killed for that. And if from a kind of like from a humane point of view, that's crazy, and that's a lot of suffering happening. But if you watch it from the animal point of view, that's just part of the place where I've been to, and I accept it for what it is, and that's it, and I move on. Which I also think that it's something that we don't usually consider too much. If everybody is being virtuous, I don't think that that will create like a happy place sort of image where everybody is living in peace and together. I think that that's the least thing that it will happen, because everybody will be trying to change and switch the status quo without trying to actually do something. And conflict will arise, and then we will have more fights because everybody will think that they are right, which maybe or maybe not, I don't know. But I kind of like, I think that we need to be really careful into considering this sort of romantic point of view. If I'm doing the right thing, then everything will be right. But that doesn't happen. I think that that's kind of like a romantic point of view. Everything can happen. That's kind of like to respond a little bit to Alvaro and to respond a little bit to Giannis. I hope that it makes sense.
Yeah, I'll transition into Alvaro. But you make the good point not to expect that outcome. I don't know. I have a problem with the argument that it's too unrealistic. And yeah, I mean, definitely, it's unrealistic to imagine it ever happening. The end to war and conflict because of an ascription to virtue. But I think the argument is that it's more of a conditional. It's a hypothetical that would never actually happen. It's a conditional that if, and this is the first point I wanted to make, if everybody lived virtuously, then there perhaps wouldn't be an elimination of conflict, but there would be an understanding of how to resolve conflict when it arises. Almost like we'd be better people to solve our problems, but never not have a problem, because that's an impossibility. The other thing I wanted to point out was that Alvaro, in the midst of talking, asked what the author was of this book called The Republic. And I'm not sure which one he's talking about. So there's obviously the famous Republic by Plato, but also I think what you're referring to maybe is the other Republic, which we have no record of. It's just we have a record that it was written, not of the actual text, is the Republic by Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, which, yes, reportedly, apparently Zeno does write in his Republic exactly what Gonzalo says is an impossibility. That, you know, Zeno basically says that the whole program of Stoicism, which wasn't ever followed by his followers, is that if everybody lives stoically, then there'd be peace in the world. That's basically what he said. He envisioned this kind of anarchistic utopia in which everybody lived rationally and stoically, and there would be no conflict, no problem with again, like I guess economics, managing resources, because we'd all be able to think rationally and act rationally to make this life a utopia. Actually, yeah, that's a fact. That is what Zeno wrote in his Republic. But yeah, I guess it's a matter of it's, for me, it's more of a division of expectation versus hypotheticals, is that hypothetically that could happen, but you don't expect no conflict. You just expect the ability to solve conflict better. Which I don't know. For me, I think we've gotten to the point of, but maybe not. If you list some of the current events, Alvaro.
Yeah, I really like the point that Ioannis made about differentiating happiness or living happy versus living the good life. And I think that that's a better description of what oftentimes is discussed as happiness in different circles, among them Stoicism. And I am also with Gonzalo. I do believe that, you know what, the Republic is portraying is a utopia. And I think that is proved in part by psychology when you start seeing the different type of personalities, and we see people such as sociopaths who have a tendency that is very different to most other people. They don't really have much of a sense of empathy, for example, for others. So at least from a psychological perspective, if you would like to embrace that, I think there is indeed a great obstacle, and it is that not everybody will have the tendency to define happiness as living a good life. With that said, I think that's indeed the problem, that you know, Stoicism indeed has a very high standard, and even if you're living a good life, and even if there is not that utopia in which there is no conflict, there are no problems, in theory, there is still a space for you to be happy, even if you're being oppressed, because you're not allowing that oppression influence you as somebody who's not embracing Stoicism. But I do believe that maybe not making this so academic, again, the emphasis of eliminating suffering versus pursuing happiness is also a good differentiation to make. And if I could wake up every morning at least thinking, hey, I'm not going to be wronged by my neighbor, you know, my wife is not going to cheat on me, etc., 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 I think there are more chances for somebody to think in very loose terms, okay, I sort of have a good day ahead. You know, I'm not going to be facing so many troubles. So in that sense, again, I don't know if I don't know if Stoicism it's really for, like, I don't know, for example, somebody who's a sociopath will necessarily embrace Stoicism, and I think most other people who are not necessarily sociopaths, but I know that there are sociopaths out there, or there are people who have a tendency just to seek their own benefit. They will question oftentimes, okay, should I live the good life, or should I live the good life only in this type of instances when I feel that I can withstand living the good life? Yeah, I hope I didn't lose you, but yeah.
Very quickly before moving on to Gonzalo, I think you were treading on that borderline criticism of Stoicism. I'm not saying you were intentionally criticizing Stoicism, but it sounded like you were basically saying that Stoics should be, or ideally are more passive than active, in the sense that the worst can go wrong. They could be oppressed, or their wives could cheat on them, but or their husbands could cheat on them, and as long as they can, you know, recede into a peace of mind, everything's okay, and nothing more has to be done. But I'm very weary of that type of argument because the Stoics were very active against injustices. But I just wanted to point out, it felt like, I'm not sure this is actually where you're going, but it just felt like you were tending towards the conclusion that Stoics sound like they should ideally be passive about the troubles around them. And I just
I will be thrilled, and I will applaud you if you can correct that perception of mine. It's not something that I concluded myself. It's something that I was having a conversation with somebody who's much more literate than I am in Stoicism, and we were bringing up that case, and he was indeed coming down with that conclusion, in which if somebody who's a Stoic, his wife is cheating on him, he should not be overpowered or overtaken by anger and all these negative sentiments, and he should be quote unquote okay with it. And that's an extreme case. I am not saying that I look forward to hear what you have to say. But again, I'm borrowing from somebody else, and maybe I'm using that extreme case to tell you, at least from.
I have something really weird to say, but will you cage up a bear and then complain that it's flying?
I'm sorry?
Can you say that again?
Yeah. Will you cage up a bird and then complain that it's flying?
Complain that it's flying after I catch the bird or before I catch the bird?
After.
That is flying in the cage?
Mm-hmm.
I guess, I mean, if you can define that as flying, but no, I don't think so.
Because that's what that's what it feels like you're complaining of, or the person that you're following the argument is complaining of. Kind of like this other person has other interest, romantically or just sexually, and they are complaining about that. So it feels like they cannot love the 100% of another person. They can only love them according to some pretty strict rules.
Well, I don't know about
but that's kind of like that's kind of like a sidetrack of
for the person. I think
it's
a very good example, because even in some places, even within the law, I think it is okay for somebody, like if you go into your room and you find your partner committing adultery on you, if this person is in so much rage and kills kills them both or kills one of them, there are some laws
justified, but it's
there
not
are some
okay.
cases in which they say, okay, that impulse is so strong that is you are off the hook. You don't have to pay any penalties for that.
It's something that it's understood, but it's not okay. There's a difference.
Well, and this guy was saying basically in Stoicism, you should have complete control over that impulse. You should not allow that to dominate you, because that's harming you. So there is no space for that. I think it is an example of something that it raises on a person his or her animal instincts, and it's a very, very raw example.
Yeah, but again,
Stoicism,
it's about
the conversation.
Hold on, I just need to hear. I think it's a little bit. I love the back and forth, but then when you start talking over each other, I think it defeats the whole purpose of conversation. Also, at some point I couldn't follow one to the other. Alvaro, just wrap up what you were saying, and then we'll go to Gonzalo again.
But at least basically from an economics perspective, right? In economics perspective, we speak a lot of times about incentives. And that's something that I like about that utilitarian approach. Not so much the example that Steve was using of, okay, if I am driving and I hit 5 people against 4 people, I think that's a bad example of using incentives and a utilitarian perspective. But if in a country you make laws in which the laws take away any interest or any incentive for the people to commit crimes, by not necessarily making them good, but by disincentivizing their wrongdoing, you're actually making people behave well. And that's what happens a lot of times with outside of Stoicism, right? Sometimes where it is in an appropriate manner or inappropriate manner, I feel that people are communicating where there is an incentive for you to do things or not. So in the case of that we're discussing, if the wife ignores that her husband may kill her and her companion if they catch them cheating, chances are that she will not do it, at least at home. You're taking the incentive. But if, and I am just speculating here that this is the Stoic approach. But if she knows her husband is a Stoic, and he'll be, okay, for lack of a better word, if he finds her cheating and nothing's going to happen, that is in itself an incentive for her to do whatever she wants to do. Again, I hope I am not losing you guys here by maybe not communicating very well. But yeah.
No, you're okay. So now I can, and before we go back to Gonzalo, maybe I just want to summarize. Also, I want to connect back to virtue and eudaimonia, but because there are connections to it. It's not that what you were saying is confusing. It's that you were jumping through like 20 hoops. And what I mean by that is that you basically traversed a range of topics which has a lot of philosophical implications. So which is why I think we need to summarize. So for one thing, if you're examining these situations from a utilitarian perspective, you have to understand that Stoics, for one thing, were pre-utilitarian. They had no conception of that. Maybe they had a conception of it intuitively, but they had no conception of that as a defined philosophy because they didn't come yet. And the second thing is that virtue ethics is totally different from utilitarianism. Utilitarianism basically says, what are the consequences of your actions? And Stoicism never says that. Stoicism says, what is the right way to act based on your character? In fact, Stoicism says to itself, you should, how should I put this? The consequences of your actions should never override the actions that you take. Because if an action is virtuous, then regardless of the potential consequences, you should be taking that action. It's very, very important that they're not utilitarians. I think the other thing you mentioned, so there's some maybe general confusion about how a Stoic can react to that situation if they find their partner cheating. But I mean, the last book of the month, the last chapter, he responds to criticisms, and there's actually a passage in here in which he asks the question, Stoics discourage the emotion of anger, but what if you were the victim of some grotesque injustice? And he concludes with this, is that Stoics are resolute, tough, and active in style. When the injustice afflicts someone else, they are highly compassionate. They react like someone who knows it by long experience. So they don't, and he also says that the Stoic cares about justice and doesn't need anger to motivate a reply to a violation of it. So just because he encounters an injustice, you have to separate the reaction from the action. Just because he reacts with indifference and reacts like, oh yeah, this was to be expected, it doesn't mean that he does nothing. It could mean that he right then and there divorces his wife and says, we're done. And then puts her out on the street, says you have to move out of the house, and does all that jazz. He does the worst thing. He responds actively, but he responds dispassionately, almost like he's indifferent to what's going on. So the Stoic will still act resolutely, toughly, and active against injustices, but they won't act with emotion. I think there's a little bit of a difference. And the whole trend in this passage that I'm reading from is that he tries to get you to imagine what a Stoic would act like if they had lived 1,000 years. That's actually a good line. He said, Stoicism is the philosophy of 1,000 trials. So if you want to know what a Stoic would act or feel like, imagine having lived that experience 1,000 times, and after the 1,001st time, you're done with it. You're just like, oh, this is old news again. But you still respond to it in a certain way that's active, not passive. So I just wanted to clear up some misunderstandings. But I mean, there's also, connected back to virtue, there's a very good connection to virtue I think we're making. And you mentioned that when you were talking about incentives, Alvaro. You are sort of correct in the sense that, let's say, the internal individual laws that we make for ourselves, like the rules of habit and behavior that we say we should conform to be a better person, right? Or maybe the government says the rules and habits we should conform to be better people or to be better citizens. Yes, that's not what happened to my lighting. Okay. When I stop talking, I'll get better lighting. Just bear with me here. You are right in the sense that Stoics have those rules. Stoics have some rules that say how you define your behavior and how you should conform to virtuous behavior. But the incentives is where they differ from how governments use laws. From the way I understand it, I'm not an expert. I've just read a lot. That just prefacing it with that, I'm not an expert. What it sounds like, though, is that when governments make laws, they don't make a law and just expect everybody to follow it. They don't. They don't expect everybody to follow it. And you know how they don't expect everybody to follow it is because they write inside of the law. They write what the consequences will be if they break the law, because they know that what motivates people is not, I want to follow the law and be a good citizen. What motivates people to follow the law is, most of the time, so there are some laws we don't want to we don't want to break because we think they're moral. But most of the time, the government says to itself, the reason why people don't want to break laws is because they don't want to suffer the consequences, not because they think following the laws are just. And this is different from virtue and Stoicism. In Stoicism, Stoics don't practice virtue because I don't want to be evil or I don't want to be a bad person. They do it for the converse. They do it because they want to be a good person. And that's very different from being from saying I don't want to have a bad life or I don't want to not have happiness. They do it because they want to be virtuous in and of itself. So it's also really important to understand where the incentives come from in Stoicism. And they're very different from how governments make laws. So they both have laws, but the incentives come from very different places. I think that's all I wanted to say. There were some things that you said that were very anti-Stoic, not because they're bad, not because they're not interesting to debate, but just because Stoics come from a very different perspective, a non-utilitarian perspective, an active perspective, and from a perspective that incentivizes virtue, doesn't disincentivize forgoing the consequences. Because for a Stoic, you don't know what the consequences are. You could think about possible consequences, but the Stoics don't contemplate over and over again the consequences because they just can't predict the future. So they don't not act because they don't know the consequences. That would be unstoic. So it's
right. I didn't want to present a Stoic approach. On the contrary, because we're discussing virtue ethics, and what I wanted to present was more why somebody will not embrace virtue ethics, right? And within Stoicism and within virtue ethics, but more specifically within Stoicism, we're coming from some assumptions, right? That not everybody has. If everybody had those assumptions, then we would be living in that utopia of that republic, right? In that ideal place in which everybody's coming from the same assumptions. So my point being that if you're a Stoic and you're coming from some assumptions, and other people, you understand that not everybody will come from those assumptions, and not everybody will behave from the same assumptions you're behaving. You have to put up with that, right? You have to understand that that's going to be the case, and still say, I'm going to stick to Stoicism. What I think is that many people, even though Stoicism and or virtue ethics is, even though it is attractive to them, it takes away the incentive for them to practice it at least 100% of the time, because they know not everybody is embracing those assumptions. So oftentimes they will say, okay, I can put up with being virtuous and embracing virtue ethics within this scenario, right? You frame it. But then if things go beyond this, I don't know if virtue ethics, I don't know if Stoicism is what I want to embrace. I don't know if it is in my best interest to live the good life. And in that case, maybe happiness for that person is not in line with the definition of living a good life. In that case, maybe for that person to have an impulse or to take, I don't know. There are, again, I think maybe the most simple philosophy for me that I feel fits the bill is maybe taking a Machiavellian perspective, a very strategic perspective, in which you come to terms with the idea that the world is not a good place, and sometimes you may want to behave in a certain way in which you're not screwed up, and if you're screwed up, you are quote unquote on top, even though it's not on the top from a Stoic perspective. Yeah.
Okay. No, that makes sense. No, also, you're also right that I also prefaced this meeting as if, I mean, of course, we're maybe examining Stoic ethics more specifically just because we are talking about Stoicism all the time. But you are right. I also prefaced it with the sense that we are generalizing this to virtue ethics in general, and think people like the Epicureans and the Aristotelians definitely had other ideas about virtue that went beyond and in different directions than the Stoics. But so it's good to hear you say that. Gonzalo.
The other thing that I want to mention two things. Is that sociopath and psychopath and the other path that we have out there, they are not necessarily evil. They're just people that lack certain social skills that, as a society, we take preference for them. Like, for example, psychopaths, usually they don't have strong emotions or strong empathy for what happens to other people. So that's something not necessarily evil, because a lot of CEOs are psychopaths and they are living in a let's say normal society. They are not going around killing other humans because they don't consider particular value in between one and another person. And they can also be Stoics in the sense that they will apply it like if they were rules, not really with a lot of compassion maybe, or with a lot of empathy, but they are applying rules. So I don't think that in these neurodivergencies, there's some necessarily incompatibility with Stoicism or virtue. It's just that you need to find alternate ways of explaining to those sort of people that don't perceive the world in the same way that you do. That's kind of like the key core that I wanted to mention before we started going back and forth. The second thing is that in Stoicism, you don't put up with anything. You choose because you don't know what happens in the other person that is in front of you. You choose something different. You don't put up with anything. You choose something because you understand that the other person is really complex thing, and your rules don't apply to another person. And that difference is about for me, you don't put up with anything. You said like, okay, I have no idea what's the reality of this other human being. I will not apply my rules to them because I don't know. I don't know what's happening inside them. That's all. And also, Steve, thank you very much, because everything that you say was on point with what I wanted to say. Yay, thank you.
Oh, okay. Yeah. No, yeah, it's also, I think it was also good that Alvaro mentioned something about psychopaths or sociopaths, because just as Gonzalo was bouncing off that, you are right in the sense that, so my question about whether or not virtue or eudaimonia is that motivation, that key end factor to why you're practicing virtue ethics, maybe a prudent question to ask oneself, right? To ask for one individual to ask themselves what drives them, what motivates them to be a good person. That's important. But you are right in the sense that that reason may not be universalizable, because maybe taking the example of a sociopath or a psychopath and not being a psychologist, I don't know the difference, but we can generalize certain qualities about them. Maybe being virtuous isn't enough. Maybe being virtuous isn't enough of a motivating factor or an end to being virtuous in and of itself to be virtuous. Maybe they need something like eudaimonia. They need the promise or goal of living a good life, having a flourishing life, having a tranquil state of mind in order to practice virtue. And I think, I forget where I read this, but there were times in which I think there was a commentator on Seneca, and they mentioned some passages of Seneca that basically referred to that Seneca does claim that, do I still have it here? Yeah, he says, Seneca, actually, this is one passage from Seneca in which he says, thus, first of all, even though virtue will assure pleasure, it is not on account of pleasure that virtue is pursued. Thus, pleasure is not the reward or cause of virtue, but the byproduct of it. However, and I don't find the quotes in here, but I know there are quotes from him, that Seneca also says that, as well as other Stoics, that they also claim that the end goal, not something you should focus on every day, you should focus on virtue, but the end goal of Stoicism is eudaimonia, is a flourishing life and a tranquil state of mind. So I think Seneca was also on board that virtue is something that you cannot live without virtue ethics. The whole point of virtue ethics is to live virtuously, but the reason behind that can change depending on who finds a better motivating factor. Alvaro.
Yes, I wanted to clarify that I also brought up the idea of a sociopath. Maybe I should have also clarified that in Stoicism, it is my understanding that there is also the assumption that everybody, at least in its core, is good. And if somebody's behaving in a way that is not virtuous, it's because they don't know any better. They're ignorant. But if they came to the understanding that a wise person will have, that person will turn from those ways. I think that's a very, again, ideal way of seeing life. I brought up the idea of a sociopath or psychopath and all those paths, as Gonzalo mentioned, because at least from a psychological perspective, it is psychology is telling us not all men are created equal. Not all men are good at its core. And I am not necessarily labeling a sociopath or a psychopath as an evil person. I'm just trying to make emphasis in the idea that we're all not equal. We all don't have the same amount of sympathy for others, on and on and on and on. With that said, I do believe that having a tendency to be a psychopath or a sociopath and not having sympathy for others, going back to the case of adultery, for example, if you don't have much sympathy for how your spouse feels if you're committing adultery, there is more tendency for you to go ahead and do acts like that because you just don't care how the other person feels. You won't feel also too bad if the person finds out. So yeah, maybe there are rules, but I think there is still a challenge there for somebody who doesn't have more sympathy for others to maybe more of a challenge for them to act virtuously.
You make the good point of still further talking about these neurodivergences, because somebody may have, you're right, somebody like Einstein might have a predilection to really understand and really be skilled at doing mathematics and theorizing science, versus somebody else who can get to that point, but it takes a lot of practice because they don't have that beginning. They don't have that, it's a natural predilection or talent to do that, to get to be such like that. And it's very, very similar to Stoic virtue especially for the Stoics. I'm not sure about Aristotle. I'm not sure about the other virtue ethicists because I haven't read them yet. But I know that in Stoicism, philosophers do make the point to say that, especially Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, they do make the point to say that virtue can be practiced, and it has to be practiced, actually. That the only way to achieve more and more virtue, what's the better phrase, to be more and more virtuous, is to actually practice it and get better at it, because virtue is a skill that needs to be owned, just like any other skill. So you do make the point that also it's an equalizing factor for people around the world, that if somebody is a sociopath or a psychopath, they can still have the possibility of being virtuous. They can still get to that point. But it does take a little bit more effort. It takes maybe a lot more effort to do that. It also is also quite nice that you have kind of a defined set of virtues. Maybe you want to add some or subtract some from the list. Maybe you have the 4 cardinal ones, but then you add a few more, or you define them in such a way that you can maybe to specify more qualities that you want to have as virtues. But nevertheless, you have some sort of concrete, defined set of virtues and idea of virtue to achieve, so that the people like sociopaths and psychopaths can still attain that, like still basically reach that promise that Stoics give, that everybody can be a Stoic and everybody can be virtuous. Gonzalo and then Giannis. Okay, Giannis, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I think, of course, there are psychopaths around us, and of course there are all kinds of people around us. But I'm not sure a Stoic should be really concerned so much how this person could arrive to a virtuous life, or how this person can improve himself or whatever, but more how a Stoic person should live between this kind of people, and expect that they will behave in a way that they, according to their nature. And so we should find a way to live around them and with them sometimes, without being affected from or being pulled away from the virtuous life, right? So, well, I found this part from Meditations again. He doesn't call them psychopaths, but he calls them shameless. That's the only place where I can find a part where Marcus Aurelius is talking about people who are really behaving in a way that is outside our intellectual capabilities, and then or tolerance. And then I think, I mean, it's nice to read the whole thing. I just put here only the first part, but at the end, what I think he's trying to say is that, I mean, don't expect that these people don't exist. They exist, and this kind and many other kinds of people, and then try to accept it. Well, not accept it, but so not even just accept it, but to show this sympathy that everybody already mentioned today, already in this discussion, can show some kind of sympathy to them and understanding. And this doesn't cancel out the possibility for you to act, but when you act, you have to act according to your intellectual, to act consistently to what is for you the virtuous way of living. It's definitely not passive way of living, but it is the consistency is the key word in my opinion. Yeah. So just to say my thoughts about it.
No, thank you. Yeah, this idea of shamelessness, it's also to keep in mind that there are people who are just completely ignorant and not intentionally. Nobody's ignorant intentionally, but people who are ignorant because of novelty. They're new to practicing virtue. They're new to being capable in social situations, and that it's both a means for the Stoic by virtue to react moderately and indifferently, and act in ways that show the other person. The Stoics didn't like to just teach by lecturing, but show the other person what the prudent or wise way to act or be is. That they have to do both. It's a lot to hold on to, actually, when you think about it. To do both at the same time, to practice reacting, indifferently and measured, but also to act with resolve and to act in a way that shows what virtuous is. Yeah, it's tough. I wanted to also look at a difference between what two books say about virtue in Stoicism that is quite interesting, that seems to contradict each other, but I thought would be a nice last question for the last segment to kind of discuss how to resolve that. And I think we've already hinted at it, but it is quite interesting to hear from two different books that we've read for or are going to read for Books of the Month, and that they say two different things. For in the last, and actually in two books of the month ago, because the last one we skipped. Let's see. Yes, it was this. It was exactly this book, The Practicing Stoic, and in which on the chapter on virtue, he quotes Stoics and other authors who come to the same conclusion, that the point is not eudaimonia. The point is actually virtue, which only gives it as a side effect. And Seneca says something like, thus pleasure is not the reward or cause of virtue, but the byproduct of it. And then he quotes John Stuart Mill, who says that those are happy who have their minds fixed on some object other than their own happiness, on the happiness of others, on the improvement of mankind, even on some art or pursuit, followed not as a means, but as itself an ideal end. So, aiming thus at something else, they find happiness by the way. So this book, he also makes commentary on the issue, that he comments on the fact that he sides with that interpretation of Stoicism, that it's really, eudaimonia is not the end of Stoicism. It's a byproduct of acting virtuously, and virtue is the goal. Here's the next book on Stoicism for reading for the Book of the Month. This is written by an academic who passed away in 2019, and he apparently was a real contributor to Stoic literature. And he opens up the very beginning of the preface to the revised edition by talking about some comparisons with the original book. And he talks about how there is that ambiguity in his original edition of he never claims one way or the other. He does claim, but doesn't explain it to his best ability. But he ultimately comes to the conclusion and says that It leaves no doubt, this book, this edition leaves no doubt that Stoicism is firmly within the eudaimonistic tradition. Stoic happiness, however, like happiness in other forms of eudaimonism, and I'm assuming he's talking about other ancient Greek virtue ethics, which are part of the eudaimonistic tradition. That is, the end of virtue ethics is eudaimonism. Puts an end to questions about why we should develop virtue. In that sense, though virtue remains the only good for Stoics, happiness is the final end. And I thought that was, he's quite strong about that although virtue is the only good, happiness, the way he's translating eudaimonia, is the only end, not the only and the final end to being a practicing Stoic. It's quite a strong statement, and actually quite a strong contrast. This is that contrast I brought up in the very beginning, but I wanted to hit it home, the fact that it's not just me bringing it up, that this actually, I've seen this in two books we've been reading, that there is this different interpretation between Stoics. Is it just a byproduct, or is it the final end? Or is there real no difference? Is there a way to resolve the issue? Because clearly the Stoics still feel, and most virtue ethicists from ancient Greece, Epicureans, Aristotelians, still know that eudaimonia, regardless of whether or not that's your motivating factor, that eudaimonia is still some sort of an end or some sort of a direction to orient yourself. So it's a bit odd. I think I feel like there's a solution. I think I have come to that solution, but I also am wary of his interpretation that the final end is eudaimonia. He's the academic. Maybe he's talking from a perspective of what Stoicism classically is and was. But in my opinion, I wouldn't want to make happiness my final end to acting virtuously or being good. But anyway, my question is not so much which would you rather prefer now. My question to you now is different. My question to you is, how do you resolve the dilemma? Is there a way to say that virtue is something you should be focusing on, but eudaimonia is still your final end? The flourishing life is still your final end to practicing virtue ethics. Yeah, Gonzalo.
No, I don't think that I resolve it, because I have, as I mentioned before, this kind of like chicken and egg situation. Because you have the skills, now you execute living your life in a different way that creates some, let's say, eudaimonia. And because you have more eudaimonia, you kind of like can practice a little bit more, or you're kind of like encouraged to practice a little bit more, and then that kind of like unravels to that. For me, sometimes the best way of explaining it is like if it was a game, kind of like the first time that you try something like Mario Bros, for example, and you're kind of like, you're bad at it because it's the first time that you interact with the controls, with how does it work, with all of these things. And the moment you start practicing more, you kind of like, you get better at it, and you can do it a little bit faster, focus on other things that not, I don't know, hitting every block with the head to see if it has coins or not. That sort of thing, kind of like, for me, creates this perfect analogy of we don't have a reset button like Mario Bros has, right? We only have one chance, and we have to create this sort of practice depending on what are the things that we are feeling for ourselves, not because of anything else. And for me, that's kind of like the chicken and egg situation. I want to practice because I want to be better at it, with the hopes that it will be happy, that I will be, I'm not really sure if happy, or as Alvaro put it, I think like as a non-suffering thing. It's like I prefer non-suffering than happy, maybe, which is weird, but okay. That's kind of like my idea.
No, thank you. Yeah, it's also what to say, happy. But I also don't like that translation, and he uses that. Lawrence Becker uses that translation. Alvaro.
Yeah, I see living virtuously and living the good life as one and the same. And again, using the definition or the term that Giannis was using, I think happiness is very different. At least I want to use an example from another book that I was reading. It was not a Stoic book, but it was speaking about, for example, the idea of being a good employee and the idea of getting a promotion. And the person was like, if you go by the value of being a good employee, you'll strive to become a good employee or to be a good employee regardless of you getting the promotion or not. If you get the promotion, then this may be a goal that you have, but you can still live by your values even though you don't achieve your goals. And I think that living a virtuous life or living a good life is a value. It's not a goal in itself. When we speak about happiness in loose terms, rather than speaking about the value, a way you want to live your life, you're speaking more about a goal. And there are different means to that goal. I think in Stoicism, you're basically emphasizing the value, and the value itself, maybe they are indeed making them being aligned with the goal. So they're like, okay, you don't have to be promoted. You don't have to achieve quote unquote happiness as, so many other people define happiness. But if you're living according to these values, that in itself is living a good life. And that in itself is happiness. I'm going to give another example, and it's the example of Nelson Mandela. And I think that's why the prisoner's dilemma is such a good example also from economics. This is a person who spent more than 30 years, I believe, in prison. And in hindsight, we may say, hey, that person was successful. At the end, he became president of his country, the first Black president. And, by these standards, he was successful. He achieved his goal. But what if he had never become president of his country? Will he still do what he did? I'm sure he will, but the question is, will we still perceive him as successful / happy? I think the idea of Stoicism is, hey, regardless of you becoming president or achieving these other goals, if you live by your values and you're willing to spend 30 or up until the last day of your life in prison because that's what you believe is correct, that in itself is happiness, and you should be okay with that. Now, not everybody's up for that, and oftentimes you're also relying on other people to have that same set of values. And spending 30 years, 15 years, let alone 1 year, I mean, it's not a small thing. We're speaking here very much from an academic perspective. But if you have to make a decision today, like through decision of, okay, am I going to spend the next 15 years, 30 years in prison because those are my values? Or will I add in a way that is not a Stoic in order to avoid that? And who knows, have a family, travel, etc., etc., etc. I wonder, at least myself, I wonder if I will really take the decision of going into prison. I wonder if I will really take that gamble that at the end, I may become successful and become a Nelson Mandela and have so many people also perceive me in high regard or not. There is a very slim chance that there is only one Nelson Mandela, you know what I'm saying? So at the end, I think not only people who are sociopaths, psychopaths, not only people who don't have a high regard for the empathy of others, where they are deemed sociopaths or psychopaths or not, we all encounter scenarios in which we don't know if the Stoic approach is what we will take, And if at least in that scenario, we will still equate happiness with living a good life.
I actually had 2 points, but the first point, that's, I think that interpretation I've heard before, and that also jives with me. That I like that. I like the idea of I like how I feel when I act virtuously. Like regardless of the consequences, when I know I've done the right thing, I know I feel good about doing that. And I kind of like your interpretation of Varro because that's happiness to me. That's eudaimonia. That's being in a tranquil state of mind. Like I'm at peace of mind when I know I've done the right thing and I've acted the best I can. That's it. Like that's all I can ask for, is that even if something terribly goes wrong, I know that I foresaw the consequences as best as I could. But regardless of that fact, I have felt good about doing good, and the goal doesn't come after the action. It's just while I'm being virtuous, I'm already having a flourishing life. That's a good interpretation. I like that. You also kept mentioning the prisoner's dilemma, and Gonzalo posted. So actually, at first, I confused the words around. I thought you were talking about the prisoner's experiment, the Stanford prison experiment at first. I don't know why I thought that in my head, because that's what I immediately went to. But then now I realize what you're talking about. Gonzalo posted the link to the Wikipedia. So the prisoner's dilemma is that dilemma such that the prisoners betray each other, thinking that they're going to get a better deal, but in fact they could have done better by staying silent and not betraying each other, cooperating basically. So that's the kind of a dilemma you're referring to, right, Alvaro? Okay, so actually it's a pretty interesting dilemma. I looked at the Wikipedia page. I don't know why it opens up with well, it says something to the effect of that shows why two completely rational individuals might not cooperate, even if it appears that it is in their best interest to do so. It's quite funny because I guess that sentence shows how ambiguous the term rational is and how people use it in very different ways, right? Economists use the word rational to explain pretty much all human beings, which I don't understand why. If they were being rational, then they would both be staying silent, right? They would both not be betraying each other. So that would be my definition of rationality if they happen to actually cooperate, because it is in their best interest to do so. But I also like the prisoner's dilemma because and game theory in general, because there's a general consensus in game theory today that it's a little bit like what you're doing, Alvaro, with virtue and eudaimonia. You're kind of putting them together. You're saying that there's not really a difference of what you're aiming for and what you're actually doing in the present. Both eudaimonia and virtue kind of converge. It's the same thing here, where self-interest and altruism converge. You know, whatever you want to do for your community is also in your best interest. It is in your best interest to cooperate with other people. And I like that. That's a noble, well, not a noble, it's a scientific conclusion from this prisoner's dilemma. And I think also leads into maybe a future discussion about how ethics in Stoicism and in antiquity in general, virtue ethics, they like to derive their ethics from observations in the natural world, one of which is, today anyway, the prisoner's dilemma, that it is best in your best interest to cooperate with other people rationally. Kind of it sounds contradictory to place self-interest and altruism side by side, but really it is the case. And maybe we do a future episode in game theory, but this is also a nice reference to make with the prisoner's dilemma. I wanted to wrap things up because it is getting close to 5:30. And before I mention any future future goings on with Berlin Stoics, what would you guys like to speak about next week? So I know next week I've scheduled an in-person meetup next Sunday. Would you like to have a virtual discussion this coming Thursday, or take a break? You know, we have an in-person meetup next week, and then we do our next virtual discussion on the 11th of November, the week afterwards.
I prefer to take a break.
Okay. I think it would also give people some time to kind of, I know some people don't want to have to choose which one of events in 1 week to attend. Some people would get the chance to attend both. So next Sunday we'll meet in person. You can find that at Untitled Meetup. And then the week afterwards we'll meet on November 11th on that Thursday online again. What would you guys like to talk about next time? Does anybody have any suggestions about it? Could also be virtue ethics in general. I mean, this is also a good point at which we can maybe venture off into other philosophies, because we don't often do that. Or it could be about Stoicism.
Yeah, or maybe instead of just virtue ethics, kind of like, what are the other options available? You mentioned always that there are kind of like there are other options available, different to virtue ethics. But I feel like a little bit curious about that. But that may be a really huge topic, and yeah, maybe it's not a good idea.
Well, we don't have to focus on it in general. I mean, this is a good introduction, actually, this discussion. But we've discussed Epicureanism in the past. We could rehash that again, though, because we haven't done that since last year, actually, like January, February. So we could do another episode on Epicureanism and Stoicism and the differences between them. But Epicureanism is another virtue ethic philosophy from around the same time. Aristotle's philosophy.
I meant outside the scope, kind of like virtue ethics are Epicureanism,
okay. So
Aristotelism.
non-virtue based.
What's outside
ethics.
exactly?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, we could take, for example, what Alvaro is referring to is that we could read a little bit of utilitarian philosophers, which is basically, if you take an introductory philosophy class today, you learn a lot of utilitarian ethics. It's also go ahead.
I was going to suggest looking more into the prisoner's dilemma. I mean, not to go down the rabbit hole and having to read a lot on utilitarianism, even though I think a good reference is John Stuart Mill's. But just looking at the prisoner's dilemma and continue maybe with where we left off, I really would like to know. I would really like to know what the opinion of most people, or like you were really clear, Steve, with what your perspective is. But to tell you the truth, I don't know if I am as virtuous as you are. Kudos to you. But most likely, if I was facing the prisoner's dilemma, I would not collaborate, and I think most people will not. Most people are maybe not willing to spend so many years of their life in prison in order to be virtuous. And most people will also have to come to terms that in this world, most people are not like you, Steve. And maybe even if they were willing to spend time in prison, they will still not collaborate, or collaborate depending on how you see it, and knowing that the other person is not going to be as virtuous as you are.
Okay. For one thing, do not call me virtuous, and do not refer to me like I'm like I'm some prime example of being a Stoic. Absolutely not. Yeah, I tread on careful water when somebody compliments me. Don't do that. Also, to humble myself, please don't do that. But so yeah, let's do that. Let's also, in addition to that, I'll mention right afterwards. So we could do the November 11th. Let's do a discussion on utilitarianism. It might be worthwhile that the Berlin Stoics starts venturing into other philosophies to understand exactly what are other options, and also what have later philosophers thought of differently. From what different perspectives are they coming from, and do we think that there are credible anti-philosophies to Stoicism that we could adopt? Or do we think Stoicism and virtue ethics at large still has a strong counter-argument against people like John Stuart Mill and the utilitarians? So what I'll do is I'll post an event today right after this about that virtual discussion. I don't know if I'll post some links because I do have to do a little bit of reading to see what we may want to read before that. We have almost 2 weeks before that discussion, so maybe I'll pull up an essay or two by John Stuart Mill we can read before it. It might be good to read some of his canonical books. I know he's also a political philosopher, so we will not read his political philosophy. We'll read more of his utilitarian ethical works. Also, speaking of non-Stoic philosophies, so after this book of the month, the next book of the month is on December 9th. It's a new Stoicism by, actually, the glare is there. Here it is, by Lawrence Becker. This is the revised edition. He wrote the original edition back in 1999, I believe, and then this is the new edition from 2017 or 2018. It is a heavy book. It's a heavier book than most other books that we've read in the past. That it's academic to the extent that he writes like an academic, but he doesn't write as if you should know all the prerequisite philosophical jargon. You could still get it, especially for those of us who've learned a lot about Stoicism in the past year. You guys can definitely get it. You guys will understand it. But it is heavy in the sense that it's a lot to take in. But that's the book we're going to be focusing on because it is canonical. It is like the book you read if you want to start reading about Stoicism in academics. And he writes the book not to summarize what Stoicism is. He actually gives a project to what this book is about. And the book is, let me quote him because it's really important also. He makes a good point. So I can't find the good quote, but he has a good quote in here in which he says that basically the program of this book is not to respond to critics or to outline what Stoicism is or was. It's to basically say that Stoicism has 3 parts to it. It's ethics, it's logic, and it's physics. And because science and logic has developed over the centuries and millennia, that because of new scientific understanding, that we may want to update our groundwork for Stoicism. And so that's why he calls it a new Stoicism, is to basically frame how Stoics can be a Stoic, or how Stoicism can be Stoicism today without it necessarily being traditional Stoicism. So it is a very famous book, and he revised it again in 2018. I'm reading the revised edition. Honestly, it's perfectly okay if you read the original, because all that's different is that he has an extra chapter or two. He has some extra commentary and an extra preface to begin with. And he wrote, like, he tells you, like, he rewrote a few pages, but like, that's basically it. It's not a huge difference. I'm taking a break. The rest of December, after December 9th, I think there's like 1 meeting and that's it before Christmas. I'm taking a break, then maybe coming back in January. The next book of the month is in February, and that is on Montaigne. I thought it would be interesting also, now we're on the subject of that you can already find the link. It's on the website. If you go to the book of the month section, Montaigne is on February 14th, February 20 something, something around there, because Montaigne's birthday was in February. it was kind of perfect timing where I thought we could do something on Montaigne, and that was his month of birth. He's referenced a lot in Stoic circles because his essays capitalize a lot on what Stoic writings had to say as well, and he said a lot of the same things. But he also came to a more skeptic conclusion about knowing oneself and knowing how to be good. But he still says a lot of things similar to the Stoics, and it would be interesting to read somebody who came centuries later. There are free versions of his work online. And there are specific essays I thought we could read. I listed like 10 or 12 essays because I don't think or at least appear like I'm requiring people to read all of them. But yeah, so New Stoicism next month, Montaigne in February. I'm definitely going to be taking a break over the holidays and maybe for the beginning of January. So the next few weeks, I hope to see everybody again. And thanks everybody for coming by spontaneously, especially. Thanks everybody.
Steve, if you don't mind me asking, is that the book you were referencing before, where somebody who had passed on wrote the preface?
Yeah. This is the same book I referenced. I quoted from A New Stoicism. Yeah. So, have a good evening, everybody.
You
Good
too.
to see everybody again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
See you next time.
Bye-bye.